preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's About Women lecture. My name is Melissa Golub and I'm the Assistant Director of Tours and Talks for the Center for Adult Life and Learning. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to remind you of the upcoming lectures, beginning with UPI White House Bureau Chief Helen Thomas on February 20th, Susan Sontag, Neil Simon, Gloria Steinem, Ralph Nader, and Michael York, and of course the rest of the About Women lecture. Elizabeth Fox-Genovese is the Eleanor Rowell Professor of the Humanities, Professor of History, and Director of the Institute for Women's Studies at Emory University. She earned her master's and doctoral degrees at Harvard University. She has served on the faculty of Emory University since 1986, as well as prior positions on the faculties at SUNY Binghamton and University of Rochester. She is author of the award-winning Within the Plantation Household, Black Women of the Old South, which was also named Outstanding Book of the Year by the Gustavus Meyer Center of the Study of Human Rights. Dr. Fox-Genovese has recently published, to much critical acclaim, Feminism Without Illusions, a Critique of Individualism, which explores the problems that have undermined much of feminist theory. Tonight's talk will pick up from parts of the book and discuss issues for feminism in the 90s. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Fox-Genovese.
Thank you. In the past decades, feminism has arguably emerged as the most influential movement of our time. I say that with deep respect for the civil rights movement. Feminism, I would nonetheless call the most influential because it implicitly touches upon all aspects of our social, political, and cultural lives, affects all classes, races, and ethnic groups. But the past decades have also revealed that as a comprehensive movement, feminism can be no better or worse than we make it. The foundations of feminism lie in the irreversible secular changes that are transforming our society. Today, the technological and contraceptive revolutions of the 20th century are decisively challenging traditional assumptions about the social consequences of biological difference between women and men. Today, economic transformations are pushing or pulling more and more women into the workplace as individuals like other individuals, which is to say, in direct personal competition with men. Women are, in effect, stepping into roles that were designed by men, for men, and that do not easily mesh with men's or women's inherited expectations. I am sure that you are all as much or more familiar than I with the results. Most men, and sadly many women, do not like to think of women as boss. Today we have much talk of the glass ceiling, that invisible but nonetheless real barrier to women's advancement into the ultimate positions of power, and it's real. We also have talk of the mommy track, the ways in which women might combine new and traditional roles. And then there are the issues of protective legislation. All of these issues, in one way or another, compel us to confront the question of how we should think about and what we should hope for women, different or equal. If the substance of feminism constitutes a response to harsh social and economic realities, much of its rhetoric and that of its opposition especially its opposition, have focused on problems of sexuality and identity. Sexual freedom, sexual preference, abortion figure prominently in the public consciousness and discussions of feminism. And at the center of those discussions lies the dilemma of equality and difference. How can women, if they are different, ever hope to be equal? How can women, if they aspire to be equal, continue to insist that they are fundamentally different? The more I have thought about these questions, the more I have become convinced than I previously was of the importance of difference. I grew up in the world in which I assumed, as many of my students still assume, that I was a person like another person, just an individual. Anything a man can do, a woman can do better, and never thought of anything but equality. Today, perhaps it's a function of age, I find myself rethinking. Even after discounting for all of the ways in which our specific culture has constructed and represented difference, created it, a biological difference remains. But the recognition of difference does not dictate the social consequences of difference. The consequences result from the views and the policies of society as a whole. We live in a world in which women must be able to support themselves. We live in a world in which women bear children and men do not. It is, accordingly, of the most pressing social concern that our laws and institutions permit women to do both. As the recent confrontation between Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas has demonstrated, the tension between equality and difference lies at the heart of a variety of feminist programs. It seems to me that women in protesting sexual harassment, and I support the opposition to sexual harassment, are asking for something more than equality in the simple sense. The political language of equal rights cannot encompass the complexity of sexual harassment. The challenge for us today is to find or develop a compelling language that can combine protection for vulnerability with a respect for individual rights. It also seems to me instructive that the public discussions of abortion, with all their complexity, have remained so bound by the theory and rhetoric of rights, notwithstanding growing impatience among many feminists with what they perceive as the male cast of logic and rationality. Even when feminist theory has most strenuously emphasized women's association with the diversity of life as it is lived in different bodies, and even when it has most vociferously attacked what is dubbed the male predilection for abstraction, feminist language has time and again tended to fall back on an abstract language of rights. The tendency to emphasize women's claims to equal rights, in contrast to a comprehensive vision of the social good, has in truth emerged from the needs and demands of feminist struggles themselves. From Mary Wollstonecraft's initial vindication of the rights of woman to Angelina Grimke's denunciation of the similarity between the condition of women and that of slaves. But the struggle for women's rights itself remains closely tied to the habits of mind and behavior that many feminists claim to oppose. And if feminists are in fact onto something in suggesting that women are both different from men and differ among themselves, then our inherited language of rights may not afford an adequate basis for powerful feminist rhetoric and programs. Listen to Angelina Grimke, one of the great original figures in the claim of rights. The investigation of the rights of the slave, she wrote to Catherine Beecher, had led her to a better understanding of her own. And I'm going to quote at some length. I have found the anti-slavery cause to be the high school of morals in our land, the school in which human rights are more fully investigated and better understood and taught than in any other. Human beings have rights because they are moral beings. The rights of all men grow out of their moral nature. And as men have the same moral nature, they have essentially the same rights. These rights may be wrested from the slave, but they cannot be alienated. His title is stamped on his moral being and is, like it, imperishable. Now, if rights are founded in the nature of our moral being, then the mere circumstance of sex does not give to man higher rights and responsibilities than to woman. To suppose that it does would be to deny the self-evident truth that the physical constitution is the mere instrument of moral nature. To suppose that it does would be to exalt the animal nature into a monarch and humble the moral into a slave, making the former a proprietor and the latter its property. When human beings are regarded as moral beings, sex, instead of being enthroned upon the summit, administering upon rights and responsibilities, sinks into insignificance and nothingness. In this single paragraph, Grimke uses rights 6 times and moral or morals 8. She evokes fundamental principles and self-evident truths. She contrasts rights that are wrested with those that are alienated, insisting that the alienation of human rights is impossible, since they are grounded in the moral nature that all men, a designation that she takes to include women and slaves, share. In a skillful maneuver, she reduces sex and legal status to mere accidents of circumstance and claims for women and slaves an absolute human right that abstracts alike from women's bodies and slaves' legal condition. In the struggle for individual rights, history, politics, and society disappear, leaving souls to stand naked before the bar of divine justice. Grimke does not specify the positive content of the rights she invokes, although she makes it clear enough that what she intended by rights was self-determination, equal prerogatives and standing with free white men. In the end, the most illuminating feature of her rhetoric seems to me to consist in her reliance upon abstractions and symbols. She and other anti-slavery feminists might turn to concrete reference to evoke responses of pity and horror to the oppressed condition of women and slaves, but when it came to evoking positive goals, more often than not, they fell back on abstractions. The silence is understandable. In their time, as in our own, the most powerful justification for opposing hierarchy lay in the doctrine of rights, which above all embodied a struggle against authority. There are limits to what you can do to me. I will not be a thing. The core of the argument against slavery. Since the 1960s, the contemporary women's movement has also relied heavily on a language of freedom and rights, even and perhaps especially when it is sought to take account of the differences between women and men. Nowhere are the problems associated with this practice clearer than in the debates over abortion. The defense of woman's right to choose to have an abortion has been squarely grounded in the defense of woman's absolute individual right and in the related argument of privacy. At its most extreme, the rhetoric in defense of this position evokes the Declaration of Independence, suggesting that a woman's right to freedom and equality as an individual supersedes all other considerations. Thus, even as many feminists are increasingly insisting upon the differences between women and men, they reinforce feminism's political commitment to individualism. The position abounds with ironies, not least because, as the political scientist Ethel Klein has argued, most women actually came to the movement or feminism more from a sense of personal grievance than from a sense of justice in the abstract. Obviously, it's mistaken to draw too fine a distinction between personal experience and a sense of justice, but the distinction helps to explain something of the tensions and mounting frustration that many feminists have experienced with the practical politics of rights. Initially, and with telling polemical force, women could argue that they had been excluded from the equal rights of the Constitution, notably equality before the law. I mean, there are some of us who can remember when married women couldn't get credit in their own names. But as the barriers to their inclusion in equal rights began to fall, many women found their situations less improved than they had hoped, and some women found them worse. Some women did find them improved, and I am not directly addressing Susan Faludi's argument here. It has considerable value, and there are also questions one could raise. Not surprisingly, some feminists began to express some disillusionment, even arguing that the very conception of equal rights derived from men's experience and accordingly could never adequately address women's specific disadvantages and grievances. The growing disillusionment was significantly accompanied by a stream of works that began to call attention precisely to women's differences from men. From Carol Gilligan's insistence that women speak in a different voice than men, to Sarah Ruddick's insistence that women engage in a distinct maternal thinking, feminist theorists began to stake out their claim that women's personal experience yields a markedly different vision of the world and its proper ordering than men's. These theorists have, in effect, countered Angelina Grimke's claim that sex is a mere circumstance with the claim that sex is of considerable, perhaps essential importance. But, and this is my main point, their claim has not led them seriously to revise the substance of the discussions of feminist political strategy. They have, that is, uneasily combined the emphasis on the difference between women and men with an emphasis on the rights of women as individuals. In the case of abortion, the contradiction has become acute. Let us for a moment focus upon the implications of the claim that a woman has an absolute right to choose to have an abortion. Does such a claim imply that a woman has an absolute right to be equal to a man? And if so, in what sense? Is the argument in Angelina Grimke's sense that sex is a mere circumstance? Is the right to abortion intended to free women from the consequences of sexuality, to strip them, as it were, the moral beings she claimed? Some would argue that that is precisely what it is intended to do. Such arguments, in my judgment, are suspect and lead into the treacherous and conflicted realms of personal morality. But it is hard to dispute that for our recently puritanical society, women's sexuality still evokes complicated feelings, including among women themselves. In this perspective, there are grounds for seeing the debate over abortion as at least marginally about women's sexuality, and as part of a larger struggle to free it and women themselves from the control of men. But the defense of what we might call no-fault sex is only part of the story, and in my opinion, the less significant. The other, and otherwise more serious part of the story concerns freeing women from their own reproductive capacities, freeing them from their ascribed and frequently self-proclaimed special responsibility for and connections to children in particular and human life in general. The struggle for the freedom to choose to have an abortion is primarily being waged on the terrain of law. Most feminists want women to enjoy the legal right to choose to have an abortion, subject only to a private, personal decision. But if this is so, it seems fair to ask what story the laws that the feminist movement seeks to defend or implement tell us about women and about our society. And let me make perfectly clear, as one who has struggled with everyone else to support those laws, I am as much implicated in as anyone else in this rethinking. I do not mean to sound judgmental, or if I do, I'm judging myself along with everyone else. The story is, from some perspectives, a rather depressing story, worthy in its way of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, of women as free and autonomous, even isolated agents. It is a story of women for whom pregnancy and childbearing constitute unacceptable emotional and economic burdens, not least because they are so disconnected from or abandoned by society, including sexual partners and families, that they cannot safely be asked to consult anyone else about their decision. It is a story of women who are still minors, for whom consulting parents means risking physical and sexual abuse. It is a story about women who are so uncertain of themselves that they cannot be asked to postpone implementing their decision for as little as 24 hours. It is a story about women, daughters and wives, for whom incest and rape are a predictable cause of pregnancy. The story told by our laws is one of desperate loneliness and anomie that is very difficult to reconcile with the prevailing feminist stories about women's special sense of interconnectedness and responsibility. On the face of it, the intrinsic connections between a woman's absolute individual right to abortion and maternal thinking, or women's special sense of morality, are elusive. Some, notably Carol Gilligan, have at least recognized the problem and attempted to defend a woman's choice as the product of a complex assessment of the respective claims of the living and the not yet born. Such arguments lead easily into arguments about quality of life. What world would a woman be bringing the baby into? It is unfair to bring a child into a world in which it will not be adequately provided for. Robert Goldstein has even drawn upon the psychoanalytic discussions of the close relations between mother and child to defend abortion. How, he would ask, could we condemn a child to come into the world without being able to count on that mother love, which is essential to its survival? The arguments from quality of life for women and children are important. but they are empirical rather than abstract arguments, and as such exist on a different plane from the argument for abortion as a woman's absolute individual right. For the defense of abortion is not grounded in an empirical assessment of the situation of particular women. If it were, it would have to be cast as an argument that under determined conditions, a woman should not be required to carry a fetus to term. This is the compromise that all other industrialized nations have arrived at. West Germany, France, a variety, Catholic and non-Catholic. Such an argument would, however, presumably require certification on the part of some group that the unfavorable conditions actually prevailed. And those who defend abortion as a woman's absolute individual right apparently do not trust any representatives of society at large, even members of their immediate families, ministers, judges, doctors, or counselors, to make the determination fairly. Theoretically and intuitively, it seems to me difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile any argument for absolute individual right with an argument for binding connectedness among two or more individuals. And if I am right, then we need to acknowledge that the arguments for absolute individual right are, as they always have been, metaphors for, or abstractions from, a much more complex human reality. In defending abortion on the grounds of absolute individual rights, feminists are, however inadvertently, adapting to women's purposes precisely that individualism and abstraction which they so mistrust in men. In this perspective, they are at the very least falling into a theoretical inconsistency. More important, the individual right to abortion will not do anything to change the social atomization and family breakdown that have led so many women to demand it. In other words, what we're fighting for won't change the conditions that make us feel it's a necessity. One of the strengths of feminist thinking, in fact, consists in precisely the emphasis on human interconnectedness, which the argument from absolute individual right seems to deny, masculinist thinking. Sadly, most feminists have not followed the logic of that insight to its full conclusions. Rather than arguing for the interdependence of all members of families, communities, and society, they seem, and I emphasize the seem, simply to be arguing that women's experience endows them with a superior form of understanding. And if that is all that is meant by women speaking in a different voice, then it is understandable that those who defend the position attribute the sense of interconnectedness to individual women's minds rather than to society as a whole. It is the woman's mind which encompasses, feels interconnectedness, not that the woman belongs to a society that is interconnected. For if society really is as interdependent as women picture it, then society has claims upon all of its members, and absolute individual right must be recognized as a fiction, an important one, a politically essential one, but not the whole rationale for social organization. Another great strength in feminist thinking lies in the value that women are supposed to attribute to life in all of its diverse manifestations. If women are indeed the nurturers of life and the tenders of sick and dying bodies, then they, above all others, must understand the claims of the weak and the dependent. Such an understanding is difficult to reconcile with the insistence that women have an absolute right to terminate developing life at will. And if they have that right in the case of pregnancy, why should they not also have it in the case of the handicapped, the elderly, and the terminally ill? In each instance, the implied argument is that one individual has a right to determine quality of life for another individual. Feminists do not usually defend the right to abortion on the grounds that women have a right to kill babies. To the contrary, the more sophisticated invariably argue that women who refrain from carrying fetuses to term are above all concerned with the proper care of babies. Yet even those who show most concern in this regard normally still rely upon individualist arguments that assume, when they do not openly assert, that there may be conflict between the quality of life for the mother and for the potential baby. The underlying assumption is that for a woman to develop her full potential, she must be free from the burden, economic burden, psychological burden, of an unwanted or unplanned child. In this respect, the logical conclusion of the individualist argument is the recognition of conflict between the interest of two individuals and the assertion that a woman has a right to put her individual interest first. The extreme case, and this, by the way, is extremely uncommon, but are the phrases one occasionally hears that pregnancy colonizes a woman's body, or that to speak of the needs of children is to fall into a patriarchal trap. Such assumptions, even when not openly stated, seem to derive from the belief that women have for centuries been forced to live out roles that men have imposed upon them. In this thinking, the role of mother and the responsibility for children becomes another male ploy to keep women in their place. There is, accordingly, a certain perverse logic in the view that to free women from men's domination, women must reject everything that men have imposed upon them. Yet in accepting this view of individual freedom, women in fact remain hostage to the most robust aspect of Western male thought, the emphasis upon individualism. Ironically, the view that women have a radically different view of the world than men, that they are especially nurturing, also derives from the tradition of male individualism that has cast women as other. You will frequently find women who will tell you, and occasionally women write about it, although not as frequently as they might, that among other things, motherhood has been, for a great many women, a source of satisfaction, but above all, and in much more complex ways, a source of a sense of power. And it should be pointed out that those who oppose abortion on the grounds that the fetus has an individual right to life fall into precisely the same theoretical traps. I'm not taking sides in this one. It's a bad argument. It seems to me that the language of individual rights is simply inadequate to the situation of a pregnant woman, and rather than trying to distort it to fit one or another position, we would do better to accept its inadequacy to this exemplary situation as an indication of its inadequacy to capture the complexities of the relations among human beings. Instead of wiping out that interdependent relation as anomalous or constricting, maybe we would do well to think about it as a model for the complexities of the relations among human beings in society. It also seems to me that the question of life is important, but rather than continuing to speak of the rights of life, which perpetuates the illusion of individual right, we might do better to think of the social context of life. If we consider human life as a continuum from birth to death, The lines of its beginning and end are blurred rather than sharp, and it should make us very thoughtful that throughout the continuum, social resources play a decisive role. Today, premature babies, who as recently as 20 years ago would not have survived, live, thanks to medical technology for which society pays. Today, people who as recently as 20 years ago would have died of heart or kidney failure live. Again, thanks to medical technology for which society directly or indirectly pays. Most of us find it difficult to accept that any single individual takes the life of another, and we usually call the taking murder. Many of us oppose capital punishment, even for those who have been convicted of murder, on the grounds that such barbaric measures demean our sense of ourselves as a civilized people. Yet we remain understandably loath to admit that innumerable factors that result from our interdependence in society impinge upon the way in which we define life. With respect to abortion, this means that many of those who most resolutely oppose abortion are also those who are most prepared to let babies, once they have been born, die or live at a level of social deprivation that should demean our sense of ourselves as a civilized people, and should assuredly challenge any complacent claim to respect the right to life. The right to life means nothing without the means to sustain it. James Boyd White, a legal scholar, has suggested that law is most usefully understood not as a system of rules, but as a branch of rhetoric, as the central art by which community and culture are established, maintained, and transformed. In this perspective, the legal scholar Marianne Glendon has argued that the laws on abortion in the United States are working to create a society of atomized individuals. In fact, we do stand effectively alone among industrialized nations in defending and in combating abortion on the grounds of absolute rights, just as we stand effectively alone among industrialized nations in failing to enforce or provide a social context that can truly value and support reproduction. Not surprisingly, we also rank first among industrialized nations with respect to violence, by any measure you choose. This evening, I'm not going to trace Glendon's arguments, but I recommend her book. If nothing else, the debate over abortion should leave no doubt that women's reproductive capacities, the only irreducible difference from men, cannot simply be collapsed into existing theoretical models. This is the essence of the difference-equality dilemma. How, that is, can a humane society protect women's difference as women without curtailing their access as individuals to equality? Historically, women's specialization in motherhood has normally depended upon an individual man's ability and willingness to pay for it, to support her. Men have paid women to be mothers, and when men have been unwilling or unable to do so, women have always tended to have abortions, commit infanticide, abandon or give up their children for adoption, or struggle along. Today, the proliferation of divorce has virtually liberated men from the obligation to support women and children. The collapse of what many view as repressive sexual norms, combined with improved standards of health and nutrition, has liberated children to have children. The growing acceptance of single motherhood is virtually liberating men from any stake in children at all. American society, with its special commitment to individualism, has long confided to women primary responsibility for the values that embody our humanity, but for which we are unwilling to pay. Nurture, care, patience, self-sacrifice. Today, at least some women are saying that they cannot assume those responsibilities without some support, saying that it would be sheer masochism to assume those responsibilities without support, saying that they are now responsible for their own survival. Some women refuse to accept that shattering of dreams. Refuse, that is, to accept that the essence of our humanity can be reduced to individual right or a market transaction. Abortion has emerged as the central issue that divides them and as the central metaphor for the nature of our society. The question remains, can women be requested or required to shoulder the burden of our humanity alone? It is a lot to ask. It may well be impossible. In the early stages, the defense of women's interests was frequently represented as a struggle between women and men. Today it seems clear to me that women's new situation requires a thorough rethinking of our social policies. Women's issues, as I think the case of abortion illustrates, have emerged as the central social issues of our time, the issues that directly concern our reproduction or persistence as a people, and our measure of our own humanity. Thank you. Questions? Yes. Yes, all right, thank you. First of all, let me be clear, I am not opposed. I am not opposed to individualism. I mean, this has been, and I'm grateful for the question and the opportunity. Sorry, I was asked if I oppose individualism, what do I see as practical policies? To give some politics, what does this mean in practice? I think what it means in practice is that we need to strengthen the sense of our rights, individual rights, as linked to our membership in society. And for me, that means that we turn attention to the very basic issues that the women's movement and women's situation have brought to the fore. And in terms of practical politics, I would put daycare, healthcare, education at absolutely the top of the list. And I would see them not as the rights of individuals, but as the obligation of society, that this should be our bedrock. The abortion argument, I would definitely favor the availability of abortion, but under the conditions I tried to sketch in my talk. In other words, with the recognition that society has a stake in and a responsibility for children, the next generation. Yes, I do think ideally some form of consent, some period of waiting, and the fiction of abortion under specific conditions are all extremely useful. They all exist in countries in which women have easy access to abortion. They're not difficult to implement. They take various forms, but France, Spain, Germany, England, Canada.
With all due respect, we're here,
Yes.
and if anything that we know about our histories, it yields to interest groups and countries supposed to kind of figure out how to handle that in whole play.
We live in a
I can buy you intellectually, but it won't play politically. They're just not really plans.
the question, the observation was that such a policy simply wouldn't play in this country, that we're not England and we're not France. Granted, we absolutely are not, and that issues in this country are decided by interest groups. I personally would favor the emergence of an interest group that works for some of these issues, and I think especially under the current economic situation, and there is a rather broad sense that these issues are of considerable importance to different kinds of groups. In other words, I'm not quite as bleak as you are about the possibility of affecting change politically in this country. I spend a certain amount of time with people who are in politics, and I know both Democratic and Republican politicians who are trying tremendously hard to work out programs that would in some way function within the American context, not to indulge in an excess of spending when we have nothing to pay the bills, but to try to look for models of subsidizing, encouraging these kinds of things. So I don't see it as a political impossibility.
I can't really see how you state that women's not having children at certain times would not make their lives easier. A woman having a fourth child when there's a bad marriage and all kinds of verbal abuse is obviously going to lock herself into a much longer period of taking care of her children that she's not willing to abandon, and making her life much more miserable. And I also think that the issue that you are raising about society and these changes, I think we're terribly far from our country taking these things on. I think that the question of equality, in my mind, is a first step. It's almost as if in the bedroom and in the home you have two people with some kind of real equality. And I don't really think that the husbands have been supporting the children. I think they've been paying their wives for the labor and the work and the many jobs they've been doing at home as housekeeper and mother and social secretary and laundress and cook that they never got paid for. So they weren't supporting the children. They were sharing their salary with their wives and paying her for her labor that sustained them on their jobs. And I think these issues have all been evaded here.
Did you all hear that? Because it would be difficult to repeat the entire question. It seems to me that in supporting wives, husbands were also supporting children in very direct ways. I think that the drastic reduction in the number of women who are supported by men and therefore free to engage in full-time mothering and service for the husband, but the whole complex of domestic activities has significantly reduced the welfare of women and children. I am not for 1 second advocating that we return to that model. I believe very firmly it is absolutely foreclosed. It is impossible. Marriage is not a viable career. All right? There isn't a law, a brother, a father that can force a man to support a woman. And therefore, any woman who gives herself to marriage as a career without the equivalent of a contract that guarantees her half her husband's income for life no matter what he does, this is playing Russian roulette with your economic future. Under these conditions, and when lots of women are not getting married, frequently out of choice, the support for children is a national priority, and it shows up all across the boards. And there is strong evidence, for example, that daycare contributes strongly to children's performance in school, which in turn contributes to their ability to do science, to the productivity of nations, go on down the line. Obviously, I'm vastly simplifying. So that's one side of the question. On the business of requiring a woman to have a fourth child when she's been in a bad marriage and there's verbal abuse, and it's not clear to me why you restrict it to verbal abuse. There's sometimes physical abuse in bad marriages too. I am not attempting to paint a rosy or a nostalgic picture, and I don't personally believe that we should consider the first 3 months of a pregnancy as socially meaningful life. So that all I am trying to say is that I think there needs to be some social consensus that in the right to abortion is not the right to take a life. It's very blurry at the beginning and the end. The same issues crop up over and over again with the terminally ill. What are the lines at the beginning and the end of life? I said socially meaningful. No? Look, a social consensus would be a political decision. If abortion were returned, the elected representatives. That is, in a democracy, how you arrive at a judgment. You would still have people who disagreed, but there is a big difference between the Congress and the courts. Of course it would be an individual decision, but the conditions under which the decision could be made, like the support for children and the rest of it, would come out of the political process and not out of the courts. It varies from country to country, but in Germany or in France, a woman who wants, first of all, abortions are done in hospitals, not in clinics. So it is, and these are countries that have health insurance. So that a woman who seeks an abortion talks to her doctor and is, depending upon, and it varies slightly, required to talk to a member of her family, or a judge, or a doctor, or a counselor, or a minister, and the combinations are different in different countries. But you don't simply go on your own. Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a society of the ideal kind that you're talking about, forget it. I mean, someone here laughed at the idea of large Congress making rules about absolutely.
Well, this is a serious problem in my judgment, because what it means is that we're looking at a situation in which women, in not trusting the society in which they live, defend their position by strengthening the interventions of arms of the state that are not elected. So that goes on exacerbating the tensions they were fighting in the first place. I'm not trying to say what's right or wrong. I'm trying to say that this is a bad scenario.
I'd like to move this a little bit, because I find most of the arguments on feminism really narrow in on a very specific level. I would like you to address the fact, for instance, you get consent for 2 doctors, but in many states, certainly most of them I'm aware of in the Midwest, you cannot get Medicaid, i.e. welfare. Women cannot get an abortion except from a friend or some illegal way. Another thing, more and more of the laws are in saying welfare is dependent on a person working. Our great welfare reform, work thing. I wonder if you could address how feminism, whatever it may be, affects this large group of single mothers who are dependent on welfare to keep alive.
In my opinion, this group has not been a high priority for the most visible and active feminists. The cutting of Medicaid abortions while abortion remains legal is a travesty. I mean, I see, frankly, no justification for abortions being available simply because of class position. I don't know if that was what you were driving at or not. The welfare workfare is actually much more complicated in my mind. In the form it's taking at the moment, it strikes me as extremely punitive. I do not believe that combining assistance with work is necessarily punitive, and a lot of the women who are on welfare would welcome an opportunity to work, given even minimal training and decent working conditions. One of the things I think the feminist movement should have at the top of its list of priorities is a campaign for benefits for part-time workers, who are largely women. The great horror of the situation of many single women, but especially poor women, is you only can work part-time, and by definition you're working at jobs at which you can't get the benefits you need to keep yourself and your family going. That's a perfectly fair question. In a sense, I asked for it. I did try to say that I was separating the empirical situation from the logic of the argument. Empirically, the truth of the matter is, empirically, we don't know. We really do not know. It's a question. I am very much interested in the long-range social implications of the ways in which we fight for different policies.
Women possibly put any trust in any legislature after watching what has gone on politically for several years, including that Supreme Court mess that we all watched. Even our president, who used to support abortion rights, has changed, and so have most of the legislature because of the power behind certain laws.
All right, look, this is how can women trust the legislature? Women are more than half the population of this country. One of the things we are not doing is talking as effectively to other women as we might talk. A second thing we are not doing is clearly defining the issues in ways in which people can recognize them as reasons to vote or not to vote for somebody. You're caught in a double bind. If we can't force ourselves to take on the political process, then what we're doing is continuing to say that we need the special intervention and help. The great danger is that eventually the means we're using become the ends we attain.
What exactly does
That means that when we say we can't get it through democratic process, so we will circumvent the democratic process on this issue, which is of particular importance for us, we may be. No, it is not. We may be, let me just finish on, please let me finish. Let me finish. The rights to abortion have changed radically throughout our history, and it's a long, complex business. Abortion was only prohibited in the 19th century. It wasn't illegal prior to that. Even the Catholic Church permitted abortion up to 3 months, right into the 19th century. But let me simply say that if we use the power of the non-democratic branches of the state to intervene on our behalf, you can do that in an emergency. I'm not saying that it is never acceptable, but if you do that, you may be strengthening the cause for which you're bringing the state in. Alternatively, you may end up simply strengthening the power of the state to intervene, and it will then pick its causes. This is a real tricky one in terms of a political society.
I may be hopelessly naive, but some of the tension I'm hearing between what you're saying and the reaction that you're getting is we live in a democracy, whether it feels like that still or not, and we have a responsibility
Let me just say on Lash's review, and it was, I am not complaining. It was an extremely nice review, but he did rather bypass my point that I don't believe marriage is a viable career. He is much more committed to the possibility of family life as the primary focus of a woman's life. So that's one difference. I am very much in favor of parental leave, of flex time at work, of accommodating that. But I am also very much in favor of daycare, and I think we're not putting as much energy as we might into thinking about what daycare could look like. It doesn't have to look like the post office or a miniature version of, no, but I'm serious about this. The fact of the matter is, it may be a little bit appalling to some of you, but there are churches that already provide assistance for mothers, even non-working mothers, so that mothers can simply have a day out. I see no reason to think about not trying to use existing intermediate institutions. I think some pressure should be put on business to contribute to this enterprise, sometimes at the place of work, but what is overburdensome for small businesses, and it really is to provide the kind of daycare that an Exxon can provide. But small businesses in the community could, with a certain amount of tax break assistance, contribute to local daycares. The French provide a choice between what they call a crèche, which would be like a small nursery school, and women who care for a few children in the home. The thing we all have to face about daycare is that if we take this seriously, it should cost some money. Now, how we get the money is another matter. In other words, we don't have to add huge amounts to the federal deficit in order to try to make caring for children into a respectable, respect-worthy career, and to think about different ways of institutionalizing it.
Could you specify in what ways feminism is not talking to other women for rights? I mean, what do you see as flaws?
I don't want to cast stones. I tried to say I see some of it as sad. Tragedy is too strong. But part of it is the media. A part of it is the causes that have been emphasized by the most visible feminist groups, and certainly now would count in this. There are, I think, a great many women who feel that the story that feminism is telling is not a story that they can identify with. If daycare, for example, but other kinds of rights, protections, strengthening of women's position are apparently linked to issues that cast men as the enemy, a lot of women become queasy, and they simply tune out and say, this doesn't have to do with my life. They're not talking about me. There is, in fact, although it's clear that a great many people in this room and scads of people whom I know care very much about the problems of mothers and children, and from the children's point of view as well as the mother's point of view. The discussions of feminism that make it into the press and are most publicly visible don't seem to have a lot to do.
With the real opinions of feminists. But how does one serve them and feminists? We have fun. Sahaba. Well, I am too. But we go to these organizations and we try to change them. We try to say what people say in this room. You have to address yourself to others, like motherhood and mother.
Yes.
I think part of what you said about I think it's very easy for us boys in middle class now. Middle class. I think the thing is that I think feminists really need to talk about alternative lifestyles. We have a whole group of young women who have decided to have children without vows and matrimony. And they too need to be looked at because we're not talking about two parents bringing up children. We're talking about a single woman bringing up a child who obviously needs to work. Not only do we need to look at that, we need to look at, as you suggested, the poor in this country, which have a very different, their identification with feminism is that. Their identification with the world is that. So, we need to talk to them in a very different way, one that is inclusive, not exclusive. And I think the feminist movement has really not looked at that or has approached that in any way that they hear that before we can talk to them.
Maybe we need to hear them before we can talk to them.
Or you need to listen before you can hear, because there's certainly talking that other is.
We have people in this country who are really trying to do that.
Oh, yeah.
But I also would like to point out that there are advantages, and most of the countries that we talked about was, advantages to having children is also identified with the advantages of being able to have health care. We don't have that.
Yes.
Emergency room is not an alternative to admission.
Oh, absolutely.
I just like to discuss some of the facts that you brought to the audience here because they leave me a little bit hazy. You seem to suggest that a first trimester abortion is not objectionable to you. The facts are that more than 90% of the abortions performed in this country are first trimester abortions, and those that are not are usually among very young women. And you also suggested for these young women that it is appropriate for parental notification. As somebody who's been involved in this for a part of my life, it seems to serve no purpose at all. When the young man was involved with this unplanned pregnancy, seems to suffer no consequences in the family in which he resides, whereas the young woman may very well, by the way, most young women do share this with their family.
Yeah.
That's our experience. And the ones who don't usually have a very good reason not to. And to impose either parental notification or consent on a young woman is unduly burdensome for the future of the young child. And anybody who really believes that this is beneficial for the family has only to spend a good deal of time counseling in a situation where you do see young 14-year-old youngsters who are deadly afraid to go back to an adult in their life and report this. And I say, that's just mere fact. And one of the other things that you suggested was that in France, there are more restrictions than there are here, when in fact there are fewer. A third of all the abortions being performed in France now are with Article 486.
Well, that's a different.
And truly give women the kind of absolute control and the kind of privacy that women in America would love to have. They don't have to go into a clinic where people outside are holding placards up and where there is the kind of clinic violence and all the rest that women in this country deal with. You know, we who live in New York, if we can't get service on 92nd Street, we go to 96th Street.
I'm not. We're not in dispute on the facts. What I was saying was that not that what you're saying isn't true, but that it is a grim story about our society. On the RU 486, Catholic theologians are working out justifications for its use. Oh, yes, some of them are. Forgive me.
I understand listening in the living room of women in New York here, two English women who are involved in the trial of RU 486 in Great Britain. And when they were asked straight out, what are the chances of RU 486 coming to America? Each of them had to say no. The church is so powerful here in terms of blocking even research with RU 486 that it will probably be a decade before we have it available to America. And it will only be because some wonderful group of people get together, finance and research a similar product, which will have to go through all of the approval that other FDA drugs have to go through when indeed you can afford the drug right now. It's that person is deathly afraid of what would happen here. A third of the hospital beds in America are controlled by the Catholic Church.
I'm not. All I said was that there are a few Catholic theologians who are working on this one, and they are. Doesn't mean that the church accepts them, it doesn't, but they are working on it.
Feel part of the reason this country is so bogged down still in the rights explanation, individualism, is that there's so much more resistance to accepting that. It seems to me in other countries, the questions of rights are not, it's accepted. It's, not.
You talk louder.
What I'm saying is I feel that individualism is still such a big issue here because there's so much resistance. It seems, this developmental process, that once those issues and rights are in place, then we can move on to the other policy, issues you're talking about. I think you can't abandon the rights issues because they're still not resolved. And I don't know why is it here that we have so much more trouble with this than in other countries.
Perhaps because the question was, why do we have so much more trouble with just establishing rights in this country than in other countries? That is all right. And I think that part of the reason may be that we ascribe more of life to the realm of rights than other countries do. Other countries start with a social baseline. Especially other industrialized countries tend to be more ethnically homogeneous, to have more firmly entrenched expectations about certain kinds of basic social policies. Countries like Germany and France, the legacy, and Britain, the legacy of the Second World War and all of the people who died left a bias, what would be called pronatalism, but what it resulted in was a lot of health, education, and pro-family policies of various kinds. Not that when American feminists refer to pronatalism, women's historians, they tend to look at Teddy Roosevelt and return women to the home and, all that kind of thing. In Europe, it has meant something quite different because it's been attached to social policy, so it hasn't made the women whose children benefit from it and who themselves benefit from it have to depend on getting it from one man. It's theirs because they belong to the society. So it's a social right rather than an individual right.
Do you see that ultimately corporations will take on more and more responsibility for family issues, for providing the support
I do expect corporations to play. The question was, would corporations take on bigger roles in providing support to women? I have no doubt that corporations will gradually provide more support to women. The bigger they are, the easier it is for them to afford to do so. If you want to be paranoid, the nightmare is a world in which only the people who work for very large corporations can count on education for their kids, health, daycare, all the rest of it, which ends up, one, just cutting a segment of the population loose entirely, and two, making those who work for the corporations more dependent than most Americans like to be.
Why is that paranoid?
Yeah. All right. I didn't say I was against. Yeah.
I mean, the thing about utopianism, it seems to me, is that you have to sort of taken care of survival first. It's really a chicken and the egg kind of thing. And you're saying, well, in order to get a better chance at survival, we need to do it together. And of course, the practical reality, especially in the heterogeneous society such as ourselves, is you have to define yourself as an individual first before you're even invited into the utopia, whether that's the corporation or the academy or the 9th Century Y or the book publishing or whatever. So what do you think, not speaking from sort of elitist position, but sort of common woman position, what should the sort of common woman do? Should she give up her struggle for sort of advancement and survival and the individualism and so on, and kind of go at it in a sort of more communal way? That's what the early feminists, I mean, you talk about the feminists. When I was working with Germaine Greer in England in the late 60s and early 70s, the first thing we did was we went to the factories and we worked with the common women and stuff. And, you know, they didn't want us, you know, they sort of had their own problems and they felt we weren't enough in tune. So that's my problem with the whole thing, is that how do we sort of bridge that gap between sort of elitism and what we really need to do to survive?
Did you hear, do you want to add to that?
I want to add to that because New Jersey has recently decided that welfare women who have more children will get no additional stipend for an additional child. And I think it relates directly to that. How are we going to mobilize the outrage those women must feel? How are we going to ally ourselves and the feminist movement with them? I'd appreciate if you'd comment, because I think that's a progressive trend in our society. Other states also are cutting off welfare benefits like crazy, saying we cannot afford this.
Look, this is, I'm going to, first of all, just I can't resist saying I think most of the people who know me would not put utopian high on the list of how they would describe me. I normally tend to be a rather crass materialist, and so, no, we don't give up the struggle to live our own lives with satisfaction, hopefully with some decency. That's not the point. The point is what you're saying. How do we learn to work with other women, to listen, to understand what their needs are? One, I'm going to try to say this very carefully. One utopian tendency we have been left with, it's a rhetorical question, is to talk about equality when we don't mean equality at all, and when we should be thinking more about social justice and social responsibility, so that we can go on being what we are without feeling we have to be guilty or that it's all or nothing. but find ways of including the concerns of working women in our agendas and in the direction of our movement. Whether it's tenants organizations, there's a wonderful organization in Georgia, it's one of my favorite, called the Georgia Coalition of Black Women, which is, some men belong, some white women belong, I work with them, but it's basically middle-class black women who have worked with the very poor and destitute women on job training and retraining programs. Its goal is to help women and their families. And there are always people who are being helped, in quotes, who are on the board. I mean, you've got to be very close to the ground to know that when you have federal funds for food allotments for infants with low birth weight, they won't get delivered if the people they're to go to don't know the address or don't have public transportation or whatever it is. I've begun to have, this may be utopian, but a vision of very basic, not the whole high-tech shebang, very basic health care that could be delivered in neighborhoods, something in the form of what the Good Humor ice cream truck used to be when we were kids. You know, not that it's everything or nothing, but we shouldn't be regressing in the number of kids who are vaccinated against measles.
There should be health clinics attached to every school
Sure.
that meets the needs of that catchment area from birth to death. But the school tends to be a focal point for the community. And it should be a clinic that interacts with the school, provides some sex education, some AIDS education, and checks kids while they're growing, so that we have a healthy populace.
Blood pressure for adults?
Makes sense. I don't know why the government doesn't do it, but it's highly individualistic. Everyone should take care of themselves.
And for feminists, by the way, this is a way of developing the role of nurse practitioners. Right? I mean, there's a whole business of healthcare delivery at that level. Oh, really? I haven't seen. I really have been saying this for quite a while, and I didn't see the Times today because I had a hectic day. Thank you. Yeah. I honestly do not know how to call that one. I really don't. And I don't, we're all waiting to see. And by the way, I do think that if it is reversed by the court, that there will be some surprising states that will immediately move to legalize abortion locally. I mean, there are a lot of conservatives who oppose abortion because they oppose it's being done through the court, but they would push it through in their own state once the court were out of it. In Texas. Do we need a new idea of what virtue is? I do think that a lot of our models of male and female virtue are historically specific. It's not that they can't transcend it. We've got, how about Antigone as a recurring model of female heroism? But I do think that women can identify with models of male virtue, and I do think that our own times badly need new models of virtue for everyone. Virtue is not real high in anyone's discussion these days, any more than heroism. I was so shocked the first time I had to deal with a group of freshmen in just a discussion, sort of orientation advising group, to find out that none of them had ever seen Casablanca. Now, Humphrey Bogart may not be the absolute acme of heroism, but for a generation that doesn't even have that nostalgic, romanticized view of heroism, this, in my judgment, is serious. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.